Hello, today I'm talking about a group of artists who painted during the Spanish Golden Age. Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the Spanish Golden Age. Now, the Golden Age of Spain, which was roughly the 16th and 17th century, was funded by a constant stream of gold and silver from South America following the discovery of the Americas. Of course, this constant stream of wealth led to rampant inflation, but nevertheless Spain became one of the most important power in Europe, and the Spanish court, the Habsburg court, became the model of courts throughout Europe, with its black, formal reserve, strict control of the emotions, severe style. The Spanish travelled extensively in Europe and actually favoured Flemish artists over Spanish artists. Charles I of Spain was born in Flanders and spent time in his European possessions. His son Philip II travelled widely as well through Europe. He was King of England from 1554 to 58. He was also a lover of the arts. When he returned to Spain after his period in England, he commissioned the El Escorial, a massive palace about 30 miles north of Madrid, and he also commissioned or built up his collection of paintings to become one of the largest in Europe. Madrid became the capital of Spain in 1606 when Philip II moved his court there from Toledo, although Seville remained the largest city economically, so the three centres became Seville, Toledo, the old capital, and Madrid. This, just briefly, the two largest regions in Spain were Castile and Aragon, and they were united in 1469 by the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, and led to the overthrow or the defeat of Muslim Spain in 1492, and the discovery of America in the same year that those two monarchs funded the trip of Columbus to America, and that led to the exploitation of the Americas and the stream of gold and silver that came back to Spain, part of which funded this love of the arts. It's also worth saying, before I move on, that the other great power in Spain was the Catholic Church. The Inquisition had been created in the 15th century. The Reformation, it can be dated back to the 95 Theses published by Martin Luther in 1517, and that was followed by the reaction of the Catholic Church and the definition of how they would respond, known as the Counter-Reformation, which was defined by the Council of Trent. And in terms of art, it's worth giving a quotation from one of the rulings of the Council of Trent. "Every superstition shall be removed, all lasciviousness be avoided, in such wise that figures shall not be painted or adorned with a beauty exciting to lust." So that was the response of the Catholic Church. The other aspect, I mentioned the Inquisition, the other aspect was the day-to-day public violence that everybody witnessed, the burning of Protestants at the stake, the burning of heretics, the banning of books, the confiscation of Protestant children to bring them up as Catholics, the expulsion of Protestants and so on. It was all part of the day-to-day life within Spain. So what I'm going to be talking about are four Spanish artists, or artists that worked in Spain, starting with El Greco. José de Ribera, Francisco de Zurbarán, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and finally Diego Velázquez. So starting with El Greco. El Greco is the first artist I'm going to be talking about, and an original artist he was. He was born Dominikos Theotokopoulos in Crete, and Crete at the time was part of the Republic of Venice, and when he was 26 he moved to Venice in order to train himself further and enrich himself in the style of the Venetian artists, including notably perhaps Tintoretto. When he was 35 he then moved to Rome. When he was 29 he moved to Rome and opened a workshop where he executed a number of works and stayed there a while. When he was 35 he moved to Madrid in Spain, and then Toledo, which is where he lived and worked for the rest of his life, and he died when he was 72. When he was in Toledo he painted in this dramatic, expressionistic style that puzzled his contemporaries, but he was a successful artist. Although he painted these tortuously elongated figures, used this fantastic psychedelic colouring, and married the Byzantine tradition with that of Western art, he was still a successful artist, had a large workshop, rented palatial rooms, and even had musicians playing while he painted. This is El Greco's earliest known work. It's called Dormition of the Virgin, which he painted in when he was 24, 25. And the Dormition of the Virgin is the belief, celebrated on the 15th of August, that when the Virgin Mary died, she died peacefully and was physically transformed or transferred to heaven. This painting shows that, which was painted while he was still in Crete, shows how he combined post-Byzantine style with elements of Italian mannerism, although at this stage it is still, I think, showing mostly the Byzantine style. The painting, surprisingly, was only discovered in 1983 when curators found his signature, Dominikos Theotokopoulos, below the candelabra at the bottom centre of the painting. This is the Purification of the Temple. We see the first version we see is one of the earliest examples by El Greco of this subject, a subject he returned to many times during his life. In a moment we'll see one of the last versions that he painted. In this version, which is his earlier style, he painted it in about 1570-71 when he was in Rome and before he moved to Toledo in 1577. In Rome he was an admired artist, but he also faced hostile criticism by many art critics. He went to Toledo in order to get the support of Philip II, who was on the lookout for good artists at the time. Titian had died, Tintoretto, Veronese, Antonis More all refused to go to Spain, and so Philip was relying on lesser talent, and El Greco thought he could get the king as his patron. He did win a large commission for Toledo Cathedral, but he didn't actually plan to stay in Toledo, as I said, his aim was to work for the king. And he received 2 important royal commissions, but unfortunately the king didn't like his work. We don't know why. It may have been that he found El Greco style conflicted with the message, the content, and one of the basic rules of the Counter-Reformation was that the message took priority and that the style shouldn't interfere with the message. So, lacking the king's favour, he returned to Toledo and in fact was received as a great artist and stayed there the rest of his life. This is the disrobing of Christ in the sacristy of Toledo Cathedral, and it's one of El Greco's most famous altarpieces. El Greco was renowned for these dynamic, startling innovations, and he was commissioned in 1577 to make an altarpiece for the sacristy, and he produced this large canvas which still hangs there to this day. What we see is the moment when Christ, standing on Calvary, sometimes called Golgotha, is being prepared for the crucifixion. At the bottom right we see someone drilling a hole for the nails of the cross, and on the bottom left we see what are, I think, the three Marys. Jesus is looking up to heaven with a serene expression, apparently unimpressed by the crowd around him. Behind him there are two men arguing about who should take his scarlet robe, while a third man to his right is already starting to take it off. El Greco is using colour to create a balanced composition. Our eyes are, of course, immediately drawn to the red of Christ's robe in the centre, and it forms a triangle with the yellowish brown robes of the woman in the foreground and the man with the drill. We're lucky in England because there's a small copy of this painting painted by El Greco in Upton House in the National Trust property there in Warwickshire. The full-size version, as I said, is in Toledo Cathedral. It's the Upton House. You might wonder how it ended up in Upton House in Warwickshire. Well, it was owned at one stage by Eugène Delacroix, the French Romantic painter, before it entered the collection of Walter Samuel, who in 1948 donated it to the National Trust. This is the burial of Count of Orgaz, one of his best known works. It's a very large picture, as you can see. It's 4.8 metres by 3.6 metres, and it's divided into two zones. At the above we see the heavenly zone and below the terrestrial zone, which are brought together compositionally. The story behind it is that many years, centuries before, in 1312, the Count of Orgaz had died, and he was a philanthropist and left a sum of money to enlarge the Church of San Tome, which was El Greco's parish church, which was where he wanted to be buried. And according to legend, Saint Augustine and Saint Stephen descended in person from the heavens and buried him with their own hands. And this event is what's depicted in this painting. It's been brought up to the time of the 16th century when it was painted, and the clothing is 16th century, and many of the figures we see in the terrestrial zone behind the burial are well-known personalities, well-known people from Toledo. This was approved of by the Counter-Reformation that wanted to make the veneration of saints clearer and relate it to the modern world. In the upper part of the painting, the heavenly world, right at the top, we see a triangle of Christ clothed in white, the Virgin Mary in blue, and To her right, St. John the Baptist, and they're surrounded by various figures, the apostles, Moses, Noah, David, they're all there, as well as Philip II, surprisingly, as he was still alive at the time. Down below in the terrestrial world, a final figure worth pointing out is the boy right in the foreground is El Greco's son, and on the handkerchief sticking out of his pocket, you can't see it on this reproduction, is El Greco's signature and the date 1578, the year in fact of the boy's birth. And El Greco himself can be seen directly above the raised hand of the knight. This is view of Toledo. Now, I've arranged the paintings chronologically, but also I've selected paintings such that in my view, each one is greater than the previous one, and this is one of the great landscapes. You could say one of the great landscapes of all time. In fact, it is the first landscape to be painted in Spain. The painting of landscapes was banned by the Council of Trent. The Counter-Reformation didn't see it as a suitable subject for painting. More impressively, perhaps, it is the first cityscape that ever existed, and it certainly from the Middle Ages onwards. He may have, El Greco may have invented the genre. It's not topographically accurate as a landscape. He's moved some of the buildings. He's moved the cathedral to the left of the royal palace in order to create the to bring the buildings together in a way that he wanted to present them. He's also through his style, through this stormy cloud it gets increasingly dark towards the horizon, he's created this unnatural mood, and the buildings seem to flow down the hillside or crawl across it. He's presenting Toledo as a place of change, place of excitement, maybe a place of danger, a place that's confronting what many believed was the forthcoming apocalypse. It was painted the turn of the 16th, 17th century, and this period between 1597 and 1607 was a period of intense activity for El Greco. He received a number of commissions, altarpieces for various monasteries, high altars, and he was commissioned to paint the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception. He was described by someone at the time as one of the greatest men in both this kingdom and outside it. This painting combines many of the elements we see in El Greco. It was painted in the last years of his life as a side altar. It's now in the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It was, before 1908, it was called Profane Love, but there were doubts about the title, and it's now called The Opening of the Fifth Seal, subject taken from the Book of Revelations, where the souls of persecuted martyrs are crying out to God for justice upon their persecutors on earth. The painting is dominated by the figure of St. John on the left, and behind him and on the right we see naked souls writhing in a storm of emotion as they're handed down white robes of salvation from heaven. The painting appears to have been, quotes, restored, that is, trimmed at least 175 centimetres cut from the top, which leaves St. John the Evangelist pointing up to nowhere. And it's been suggested that there was a top part to this painting which represented sacred love, whereas that's why this painting was called Profane Love. It was sold around about 1880 to an artist who revived interest in El Greco and presented it to other artists, including Pablo Picasso, who saw this, and other people have described this painting as a precursor of modernism, and I'd like to explore that one step further. It's been suggested that the opening of the fifth seal was an inspiration for the early Cubist works of Pablo Picasso, especially the work we see here on the left, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which mirrors in a way the expressionistic angularity of El Greco's painting. We know that when Picasso was working on Les Demoiselles, he visited his friend, an artist who had El Greco's work in his studio, and the relationship between the two paintings was analysed in the 1980s, when many stylistic and subject relationships were explored. One opinion is that the clothed figure on the left and the naked figures on the right show the contradiction between profane and divine love, and this may have been the inspiration for Picasso, because in his preliminary drawings he shows a medical student holding a skull or a book and entering a room where there's a sailor amongst naked women in a brothel in Avignon. One critic has suggested that the painting by El Greco suggested ideas to Picasso about how he might harness the spiritual energy of a great religious work to his own demonic ends. And according to one writer on Picasso, who published a book called Picasso's Apocalyptic Whorehouse, Picasso followed this apocalyptic vision his whole life. We now turn to Francisco de Zurbarán, who has been described as the Spanish Caravaggio. He is known mostly for his religious paintings depicting monks, nuns, martyrs, and for his still life. His work is, like Caravaggio, uses chiaroscuro to the full. Chiaroscuro, remember, is light and dark. It's using the strong side light, almost like a spotlight coming into the painting, to heighten the tension, heighten the emotion. Let's look at one. This is St. Luke as a painter before Christ on the cross. It's at the Prado. Some say that it's possibly that the St. Luke is a self-portrait of Zurbarán. Zurbarán was born in the west of Spain in 1598, not to an artistic family. His father was a haberdasher, but he showed artistic abilities and was sent to Seville as an apprentice. He married 3 times altogether. His first 2 wives died in childbirth, but his second and third wife were wealthy widows. He was 28 before he received his first major commission, and he produced 21 paintings in just 8 months for a Dominican monastery in Seville. This established his reputation, and within a couple of years he was commissioned by another religious order in Seville to produce 22 paintings, and by then he'd become so famous that the city elders invited him to live permanently in Seville, and he moved there with his wife and family. In 1630, when he was 32, he was appointed to Philip IV as painter, or as Philip IV said, painter to the king, king of painters. He didn't stay popular all his life. Within 10 years, by 1640, his austere, harsh, hard-edged style went out of favour in comparison to the sentimental religiosity of Murillo, who was preferred, and Zubran's reputation declined. He started to produce many paintings that he exported to South America. Some say that when he died when he was 60, that he died a pauper, died in poverty. But we know that his estate, when he died, was worth about $2,500 Spanish dollars, or pieces of 8. So he died well off, even though by the time he died he was out of favour. I mentioned the term chiaroscuro. I'd like to spend a little bit of time defining it a bit more precisely, along with some other terms. There's two meanings really. It's most commonly used to refer to a strong contrast between light and dark, bold contrasts that affect the whole composition. But it's also used as a more technical term by artists and art historians to mean a contrast of light used to create a sense of volume or three-dimensionality in a picture. So not as extreme. In fact, extreme chiaroscuro, which literally means light and dark, is called tenebrism, from the Italian tenebroso, dark or gloomy, and that's an exaggerated form of chiaroscuro, where dramatic illumination, like a spotlight, comes in to light up an otherwise completely dark picture. Very popular in Baroque paintings. Also, other terms used to describe Italian High Renaissance painting. There's cangiante, meaning a change in colour to suggest shadow without actually using or adding black or brown to the colour to make it darker, and thus retaining a purer colour. Sfumato, smoke-like, which is a soft transition, a smooth transition between colours, smoke-like. And unione, which is like sfumato in that it harmonises transitions, but it's used also like chiaroscuro in that it uses contrast but without the same harshness that you get in chiaroscuro. And here's an example. I said Zubrin painted still life. This is called still life with lemons, oranges and a rose. Very like Caravaggio. We don't know whether Zubrin met Caravaggio or in fact even saw his work, but he's often described as the Spanish Caravaggio, and here we see a good example of chiaroscuro, to the extent that you could use the term tenebrism to refer to this work. These paintings were commissioned by Philip IV of Spain for one of his palaces, and they represent the labours of Hercules. Now, traditionally, there are 12 labours of Hercules, and Hercules, just briefly to set the background, the story was, the Greek mythology was Hercules, who was the son of Zeus, but not by his wife. His wife Hera found out that he'd had a child, tricked Zeus into making the next king of Greece a sickly man, Eurystheus, and then sent a serpent to kill Hercules when he was a baby, but the baby strangled the serpent and he grew up, and later she made him mad. He killed his wife and children, and as penance he became the the servant of Eurystheus, and the 12 labours were imposed. Now, of the 12 labours, this set of 10 paintings represents 8 of them. And well, before going through them quickly, it's worth pointing out that in the Renaissance period, they were regarded not as adventures so much as allegories, moral allegories. Represent, for example, the boar represents a lack of self-restraint, so that is being killed by Hercules. The bull, irrational passions. The Augean stables, the foulness of humanity, and so on. So the reason that these paintings were commissioned is as an allegorical representation of wisdom overcoming human frailties. Now, if we look at the top left, the first one is Hercules separating 2 mountains, sometimes called or sometimes thought to represent the pillars of Hercules, which separate the Mediterranean from the Atlantic. It's also, if you look carefully, there's 2 sort of metal rods sticking out of the rocks, and it's thought that he's actually pulling the 2 rocks together rather than keeping them apart. And this possibly represents Philip IV as a monarch who unites disparate lands. This is followed by the next painting to its right of Hercules defeating King Geryon, a giant. That is one of the labours, but it's the 10th of the 12 labours in the original story. And in the original story, Geryon was a giant with 3 heads and 6 arms and a 2-headed dog. So that's been slightly modified here. The next one is the Nemean lion, which he kills with his bare hands. And you often see Hercules wearing a lion's skin as a cloak. Well, that's comes from this Nemean lion that he killed as one of the labours. Then we have the boar, the 4th of the 12 labours, that he's killing with his club. Then the next row down on the left, we have Hercules and the Cretan bull, the 7th of the 12 labours. Now, the Cretan bull was the father of the Minotaur, and the Cretan bull wasn't killed by Hercules but was sent back to the king, but the bull escaped and wandered to Marathon. To cut a long story short, both the bull and the Minotaur were later killed by Theseus, who's the mythical founder hero of Athens. The next painting was Hercules fighting Antaeus, which was the first of the 11, the first of the labours, or the first part, was the first part of the 11th labour, while he was on his way to find the golden apples of the Hesperides at the ends of the earth. Antaeus had killed all of his rivals and in fact made a hut out of their skulls, but Hercules found out that he derived his strength from touching the earth. So what Hercules did is he held him aloft and crushed him to death with a bear hug without allowing his feet to touch the ground. In the next painting, Hercules is defeating the 3-headed dog Cerberus, which he had to bring back from the underworld, the 12th and hardest labour, as he had to visit hell and still the guardian of the gates of hell, which he succeeded in doing. Then we have Hercules diverting the course of the river Alpheus to clean the Aegean stables in a single day, the 5th of the 12 labours. And then on the bottom row, Hercules killing the 9-headed Hydra of Lerna. And finally, this isn't one of the 12 labours of Hercules, but it's showing the death of Hercules. It's a complicated story, but when he killed the Hydra had poisonous blood, and Hercules' wife was tricked into giving him a shirt stained with this poisonous blood of the Hydra. And as soon as Hercules put it on, his skin caught fire and the skin was burnt from his bones, and he eventually died. This is a final painting by Zubrin showing mystic contemplation. We see Saint Francis holding a skull, symbol of death. He is looking upwards. His mouth is slightly open, as if he's engaged in a conversation with God, and you can see on the palm of his hand the stigmata of Christ that he is said to have received in 1224. He's wearing the habits of the Franciscan order, who was dedicated to poverty. You can see the holes in his clothes as he kneels to pray, and you can just make out in the background the small hut in which he lives. There was an exhibition of Ribera's work at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2018. It was called Ribera, Art of Violence. He is an artist that often showed the violence of the age. Many of his works are shocking to see. Masterfully composed, sensational. He's one of the leading artists of the Spanish Baroque age. He was born in Valencia, Spain, but emigrated to Italy as a young artist in 1606 and spent most of his career in Italy, in Naples. At the time, of course, Naples was part of the Spanish Empire, and he influenced many other artists. He's often regarded as an heir to Caravaggio for his dramatic light and shadow, called chiaroscuro, although in the extreme form the word tenebrism is sometimes used as well, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is a self-portrait of José de Ribera, the Spanish tenebrist painter. I said I'd explain that term. It's related to the Italian tenebroso, meaning dark or gloomy or mysterious, and it's really a type of chiaroscuro, which is dramatic lighting, but taken to an extreme. So where you get mostly black and as if a spotlight is lighting up part of the picture. That another term we can use is tenebrism, where the darkness is really the dominating part of the picture. His works are often dark, gloomy and startling, and he's an artist who depicts the horrors and really the realities of human cruelty. It was so common at the time, as I've mentioned, public torture, burning to death, that one wonders really why other artists didn't depict it more often. But it's something that Ribera dedicated his life to showing. There is a legend that the owner of one of his works had a wife who gave birth to a child with deformed fingers because she saw one of his paintings of a figure whose hands were distorted in agony. That clearly shows that at the time he had an impact on the people living at the time, even though they were used to extreme violence. He gained international renown living in Naples. Although he didn't return to Spain, he always asserted his Spanish birth, his Spanish nationality, although he described Spain as a very cruel stepmother. And an artist that influenced him greatly, according to his biographer, surprisingly in a way, is Raphael. This first painting by Ribera that I'm showing you is, it's called The Bearded Woman. Yes, surprisingly, the person standing in the centre, suckling a child, is a woman who grew a beard at the age of 37. In this painting, she's 52. Apart from the breast, she shows none of the signs of being a woman. She's tall, well set, strong, with a full beard, hairy hands, large hands. And she became, it's a real person, she became a celebrity in the 17th century in Italy. And Ribera was commissioned by the Viceroy of Naples, where he lived at the time, to make a portrait of her. And we can see that Ribera has treated her not as a freak, but as a human being with sensitivity and understanding rather than curiosity. Although at the time, people with unusual bodies were of general interest and toured the country, but the interest was not sympathetic, it was one of curiosity. Another different example of Ribera's work, this is The Sense of Taste. It was part of a series of the illustration of the five senses, which we believe he painted for a Spanish client. It was a popular theme, particularly in the Netherlands in the late 16th century. And what he's showing us here is the embodiment of gluttony. We have a man sitting in front of a bowl containing what might be pasta with a full glass of wine. The man has red cheeks and a nose swollen, but notice his hand, his left hand, the fingers are swollen, which is indicative of gout. Now, gout was regarded as an aristocrat's disease, but he's a common working man, showing that it's a warning against overindulgence, which this warning is aimed at all levels of society. It's one, as I said, of the five senses. Hearing has been lost. This one is in America, in Hartford, Connecticut. The smell is in private collection. Sight is in Mexico, and his painting of touch is in Pasadena in America. And this final work by Ribera was shown at the exhibition at Dulwich, Ribera Art of Violence, and it shows a mythological scene. I mean, Ribera showed many of the atrocities of the Spanish Inquisition, but here he's showing a scene where the god Apollo is skinning Marsyas alive for daring to compete with him musically. We almost can hear the Marsyas screaming as Apollo is actually skinning him alive, not with a knife is the way it's often shown, but with his bare hands. The torture and brutality of Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, was displayed daily on the streets of Naples. Every man, woman and child would have seen people being hanged, beheaded, tortured, burnt alive. And Ribera painted what he saw with honesty, which makes him an artist that will, in that sense, always be contemporary. Bartolomé Esteban Murillo. He was born in Seville and stayed there, lived and worked his entire life in Seville. Now, Seville, although it wasn't the capital, was the premier city of Spain, the commercial centre, equal in power, population to the major cities of Europe like Venice, Amsterdam and Madrid. He's best known for his paintings of women, children, realistic studies, flower girls, street urchins, beggars and so on, although he also painted a lot of religious works. And he's a storyteller. He holds up a mirror to the ordinary people of Spain and makes sure that we see their best qualities. This is Murillo, self-portrait, painted in about 1668. He, as I said, he was the leading painter in Seville in the late 17th century and remained one of the most admired and popular of all European artists in the 18th and 19th century. His work was influenced by the early work of Velázquez and Zubrin. He painted a lot of religious paintings, for example, the convent of San Francisco in Seville, paintings in the cathedral, and he also visited Madrid, and we believe that he almost certainly saw the work of Rubens and Van Dyck and contemporary Italian painters who influenced him. His style became increasingly free over the years, and we'll see an example of that later. Here we see a typical Murillo painting, the Holy Family with a bird. A domestic scene. The Virgin Mary is shown winding wool onto a ball. The Joseph is shown with his carpenter's bench and tools behind him, and they're both looking at the Christ child who's playing with a bird. See, there's a bird in his hand and holding it away from a dog. This is typical of the work of Murillo. It's we see what looks like a normal domestic scene. Notice there's no halos in sight. There's a child playing with a bird and a dog. A mother and father watch. In this case, though, we see a new type of representation of the Virgin Mary as a mother sewing, the father, Joseph, not as a grey-haired old man, but as a strong, middle-aged man. Another example of Murillo's work shows his illusionistic or Trombley fooling the eye, so that it looks like two women leaning out of a real window. This type of painting was rarely painted by Spanish artists, and it was typical of Flemish artists. So it's been suggested that he might have painted this for a Flemish or Dutch client who would have been familiar with this type of work. The young girl looking out of the window, let me show you a close-up there, is wistfully smiling, while the woman in the background, an older woman, has her mouth covering a smile. In fact, it was polite in Spanish society of upper-class households. It was considered good etiquette to cover your mouth when smiling among the aristocracy. The painting has also been interpreted as a darker theme, partly because a later engraving of the work was called The Galatian Women, at a time when women from Galatia were regarded as, or reputed to be, prostitutes. It therefore, and also when it was exhibited later, it was exhibited under the title Spanish Courtesan. So another interpretation is that we have a woman at the window soliciting clients. The woman behind her, it's been suggested, is not Picuress, but because she's not that much older. So maybe they're both young women flirting at a window. The interpretation you put on it is purely down to the viewer, I think. As I said, Murillo often portrays street children and beggars. Here we have a black boy asking for or begging some pie from a boy sitting down in front of him who appears to be refusing to give it to him. But if you look at it more carefully, it's called Three Boys, and the black boy is wearing shoes, fairly smart clothes, is carrying an earthenware jug, and maybe he's a servant or slave on an errand. He might actually be in a better position socially than the white boys, who may, of course, have stolen the pie. The servant boy, it's been suggested, the black boy, could have been a portrait of the son of Murillo's household slave girl, who we believe was born in 1658 and whom Murillo freed when she was 18. And it's been suggested as well that the two white boys were modelled on Murillo's own sons, Gabriel and Gaspar. The painting's unusual in that Murillo rarely corrected his work when he was painting it, but here we know from X-rays that he made changes, that the boy sitting was smirking, his teeth were bared mockingly, and the black boy's hand was being physically pulled away from the pie. So it seems as though Murillo has softened the picture and made the reading of it more subtle. Of course, this isn't meant to be a realistic portrait of vagrant life in 17th century Seville. This is a constructed narrative where Murillo is making a particular moral point. This is the Immaculate Conception of Los Venerables, the Venerables. It was commissioned by the Canon of Seville Cathedral for his personal collection, and he later donated the painting. The Immaculate Conception, which is the belief that Mary was without sin and that Jesus was conceived without a father, had been growing in Spain since the 16th century. And it was a fought for belief which eventually became Catholic dogma, but not until 1854. It was, I think, the most common subject that Murillo painted. He painted some 24 versions, more than any other artist at the time. Here we see the Virgin Mary wearing a white robe and a blue mantle with her hands crossed across her chest and a crescent moon at her feet, and she's looking up to heaven. It was, in 1813, looted and taken to France, and the Louvre, in 1852, paid over 600,000 francs for the painting, the largest amount they'd paid for any painting at the time. And it was exhibited continuously by the Louvre until 1941, when Murillo's art fell out of fashion and it was swapped. It was returned to Franco in exchange for some other work, so it's now in the Prado. Our final painter, Diego Velázquez, the most famous painter of the Spanish Golden Age and the most important and influential. A leading artist in the court of Philip IV. Philip IV would sit and watch him paint, and Velázquez was also responsible for his collection, and he acquired paintings from all the great artists, making the collection which became the exhibit now exhibited in the Prado. The collection he built up was the basis of the Prado collection we see today. He had an individualistic style, and he painted portraits of the Spanish royal family other leading European figures as well as commoners, and it culminated in perhaps his most famous work, Las Meninas, which he painted in 1656. Old Woman Cooking Eggs, an early masterpiece by Velázquez. It clearly demonstrates his flair for painting people and everyday objects from life. Now, this type of painting, these amusing and popular genre scenes, were known as bodegon, which literally means tavern or wine cellar, but it's come to mean still life. And it was regarded as the lowest form of art and despised by connoisseurs. One wrote, "Workmen, probably Velázquez, of scant knowledge or reflection, who debase the noble art to vulgar notions, as we see today in so many pictures of bodegons." Now, Velázquez was very conscious of his mastery of painting, his technique, and he painted to dazzle. This isn't intended as trompe-l'œil. It's not intended to fool you into thinking the objects are natural objects. You're intended to see it as paint, not to fool you, but to dazzle you with his virtuosity at manipulating paint to create these objects that are radiating in their own light. It's difficult to see where the light's coming from. Maybe from a window to the left of this scene. The two figures in the scene are not looking at each other, not looking at us. They seem to be bemused, transfixed by or lost in their own thoughts. The woman seems to have briefly stopped in her cooking. She's holding an egg, ready to break it into the pot, but she's paused. Everything in the painting, in fact, is paused. The individual items, the dishes, the pestle and mortar, the onion, they all demonstrate his ability to represent crockery, vegetables, eggs cooking, in the way that he handles the paint and the way that he addresses these poor people makes them transcend the scene that we see. It's not a vulgar notion. It's in some ways a spiritual statement. Velázquez was only 18 or now. A few years later, when Velázquez was about 35, he travelled to Italy accompanied by Ambrogio Spinola, who is the figure shown here, who has just conquered the Dutch city of Breda a few years before. It's called the Surrender of Breda. And what we see is the transfer of the keys of the city from probably the mayor of Breda to Ambrogio Spinola. In other words, it's a picture which was probably commissioned by Spinola from Velázquez to celebrate his victory over Breda, and it's considered by many to be one of his finest paintings. Just to show you in close-up how he's managed the paint here, the detail of the background, the accuracy of the lace collar of the armour demonstrate his technique. The Toilet of Venus, or what's generally known as the Rockby Venus. It's the only surviving example of a female nude by Velázquez. the subject was rare in Spain because it was not approved of by the church. Venus, the goddess of love, the most beautiful of the goddesses, is regarded as the personification of female beauty, and she's shown here with her son Cupid, who's holding up a mirror for her to look at herself and also at us. It's unclear whether she's looking at us in the mirror or at herself. The painting was first recorded in 1651 in the collection of the Marqués de Carpio, the first minister of Spain, and it was probably commissioned, painted for him and displayed privately so that it didn't invoke the censure of the Spanish Inquisition. It was called, or it's called, the Rockby Venus because it ended up in the Morit collection at Rockby Park, which is in County Durham, before it was acquired by the National Gallery, which is where it is now. It's interesting that, as you can see, it was slashed in 1914. A small, soberly dressed woman carrying a sketchbook entered the National Gallery, took out a meat chopper which she had hidden up her sleeve, and slashed the painting. The painting, as it happens, was displayed on an easel, and the attendant, the guard, heard the breaking glass and thought it was a skylight breaking. He didn't realise what had happened, and when he saw what had happened, he rushed across to the painting but slipped on the recently polished floor in his haste to stop her. She was Mary Richardson, a militant suffragette, and she was sentenced to 6 months in prison. She said, "I have tried to destroy the picture of the most beautiful woman in mythological history as a protest against the government destroying Mrs. Pankhurst, who is the most beautiful character in modern history. Justice is an element of beauty as much as colour and outline on canvas." Emmeline Pankhurst had been arrested in violent circumstances the day before, and Mary Richardson, was a student of art, and she said that it had been very difficult for her to damage such a beautiful work, but that her hand had been forced by the government's indifference to the suffragettes. She also said in an interview some decades later, "I didn't like the way men visitors to the gallery gaped at it all day." In general, the reaction of the press was one of outrage. They acted as if a person had been attacked and referred to Slasher Mary or the Ripper, a reference to Jack the Ripper, who had murdered women 25 years previously. The painting was described as a victim of her attack and the damage as cruel wounds. After the attack, the National Gallery, the Tate, Hampton Court and Windsor Castle were all closed for 2 weeks to stop copycat slashing, but in fact over the next 5 months 14 other paintings were slashed and 9 women arrested. The paintings don't it doesn't seem clear why the paintings were chosen. They slashed Giovanni Bellini's The Agony in the Garden, Gentile Bellini's Portrait of a Mathematician, and John Singer Sargent's Portrait of Henry James. This has been described as one of the finest portraits ever painted. It's of the Pope, portrait of Pope Innocent X. It's the Pope himself was highly intelligent, shrewd, and an ageing man at the time. He was wary of Velázquez painting his portrait, and it seems that Velázquez showed him an example of his work and he relented. When it was finished, he exclaimed, "Troppo vero," all too true, and it does show you the character of the Pope, and it's signed by Velázquez on the piece of paper the Pope is holding, and it's influenced many artists since. One of the famous ones is Francis Bacon's series of distortions known as the Screaming Popes. He painted some 45 variations between the 1950s and 1960s of this painting. This one I'm showing you is study after Velázquez's portrait of Pope Innocent X, which he painted in 1953. This is was originally thought, it's called the Spinners. It was originally thought to depict a tapestry workshop, but it's recently been argued that it represents the story of its fable of Arachne. That's the story of the mortal Arachne who dared, always a bad idea, dared to challenge the goddess Athena to a weaving competition, and inevitably she lost and was turned into a spider by the jealous goddess. It was painted for the huntsman to King Philip IV of Spain, but was damaged by fire in 1734, and new sections were added. This is the sections that were added I've shown you, and it's now displayed behind a screen that hides those additions. In the foreground we see the spinners. The goddess Athena, disguised as an old woman, is on the left, and Arachne in a white top facing away from the viewer is on the right, with three helpers assisting. And in the background, on a raised platform, which could be a stage, the finished tapestry is being shown. The person visible to us is Arachne, and she's showing the picture, which is the rape of Europa, another Greek myth. And in fact, the picture is a copy of Titian's painting of that subject, which was in the Spanish Royal Collection. The work has been interpreted in various ways, contrasting the intellectual activity of the goddess representing fine art with the manual dexterity of Arachne representing craft. And maybe in this painting Velázquez was showing that a great work needs to combine the creativity of the intellectual activity and the hard technical craft work. This is it. This work has been described by many artists and critics as the greatest painting ever produced by any artist. It raises profound questions about art and illusion and about the viewer and the figures depicted. It's called Las Meninas, the Maids of Honour. It's one of the most widely analysed works in Western art. What we see on the left is Velázquez looking out at us, holding a paintbrush and a palette. In the centre is the 5-year-old Margaret Teresa. It's assumed that Velázquez is painting not us, but the king and queen, who we can see reflected in a mirror at the back of the room. So they are either standing next to us, so to speak, or we are the king and queen. Two ladies in waiting are attending to Margaret Teresa. One of them is just starting to curtsy as she looks up. On the right we can see two dwarves, one of whom is kicking or nudging a sleeping mastiff. Behind them is the chaperone of the royal princess, talking to or glancing towards a bodyguard, and in the doorway is the Queen's chamberlain, pausing in the doorway and holding back a curtain. Now, one of his jobs was to open doors for the Queen, and so it's been suggested that this is the moment when the King and Queen are standing and about to leave, which explains why one of the ladies in waiting is beginning to curtsy and why the chamberlain has opened the door and is holding back the curtain. The painting session, in other words, has just come to an end. The mirror in the back reminds us of Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, painted in 1434, which was owned by Philip and so would have been known and seen by Velázquez. It's been suggested that the painting, in the way that it plays with illusion and raises questions about what is being painted, is about art and life being an illusion. And a contemporary Spanish playwright at the time wrote, "What is life? A frenzy. What is life? A shadow, an illusion, and a sham. The greatest good is small. All life, it seems, is just a dream. And even dreams are dreams." The most deep analysis is perhaps Michael Foucault's in The Order of Things. He devotes a whole chapter to this painting. And interestingly, he doesn't discuss the subject matter, the biography of the artist or the people, or even the social context. He considers the relationships in looking, the complex network of visual relations between the figures shown in the painting. He suggests that the painting is a new way of thinking for all European thought and illustrates a discontinuity between what he calls classical way of thinking and the modern. The classical is about representing something in art. The modern is about the person doing the representing, the artist. And in this case, the artist is included himself in the picture, is representing himself. He's not just represent. That doesn't mean there haven't been self-portraits before now. There have been self-portraits, but those self-portraits are themselves the artist representing themselves as an object that is seen, so it's not about the artist. It's a view of the artist, if you like, as an object. Whereas in modern art, it's the artists themselves that are including themselves, their feelings, their thoughts, their views in the work that they're representing. It's the modern view of the world. And we'll end at that point with this most famous painting by Velázquez.